I want to start by talking about weight, not the kind you measure on a scale, but the kind you carry quietly. The kind that doesn't show up in photographs but changes how you stand, how you breathe, how you choose your words. Secrets have mass. We like to pretend they don't, that thoughts are weightless, that what's unspoken simply disappears into the background. But psychologically, that's not how humans work. Anything unresolved occupies mental bandwidth, it consumes energy, and over time, it begins to distort the system. When you hold a secret from someone you love, you're not just withholding information. You're running two parallel realities at once. There's the shared reality, the one you both participate in, and then there's the private one, where you're constantly editing yourself. Every sentence is filtered. Every moment carries a calculation. Can I say this? Will this lead there? That constant internal processing is expensive. Cognitive science tells us that the brain is remarkably efficient when aligned and remarkably exhausted when divided. A secret introduces friction into the system. At first, it doesn't feel dangerous, it feels practical. You tell yourself you're protecting them, or protecting the relationship, or just waiting for a better moment, some hypothetical future where conditions are perfect and the truth will land softly. That moment almost never arrives. Instead, the secret becomes more entrenched. The longer it stays hidden, the more significance it seems to gain, not because the truth itself has changed, but because you have changed in relation to it. Philosophically, this is where things get interesting. We often define honesty as a moral virtue, something external, something you owe to others, but there's another layer that's harder to ignore: honesty as internal coherence. When what you know, what you feel, and what you express are aligned, you experience stability. When they aren't, you experience tension. That tension doesn't stay neatly contained. It leaks. It shows up as distance, irritability, a subtle lack of presence. Love can survive many things, but it struggles in an environment where one person is no longer fully there. And here's the uncomfortable part. Even when the secret is meant to spare the other person, it still creates asymmetry. One of you has access to the full picture, the other doesn't. That imbalance quietly shifts the relationship, decision-making changes, intimacy changes. You're no longer choosing together, you're choosing for them. That may come from care, but it also removes their agency. And deep down, most people can sense when something is off, even if they can't name it. Humans are exceptionally good at detecting inconsistencies. We evolved that way. So the weight grows, not dramatically at first, more like compound interest. Each day you don't speak, the cost increases slightly. The mind revisits the secret in idle moments, late at night, in conversations that almost drift too close. The emotional load doesn't stay static, it accumulates, and eventually the effort required to keep the secret becomes greater than the effort required to tell it. That's usually the point people reach just before they speak. Not because the fear is gone, but because the internal cost has crossed a threshold. They realize that silence is no longer neutral. It's doing damage, not always in visible ways, but in structural ones. The foundation starts to weaken, not because of the truth itself, but because of the ongoing avoidance of it. I want to be clear about something. Holding a secret doesn't make you malicious. It makes you human. Fear of loss is one of the most powerful motivators we have. The fear that honesty might cost you love can feel existential. But there's a paradox here that's easy to miss. The very thing you're afraid honesty might destroy, connection, is often what secrecy erodes first. When you love someone, you don't just want them close, you want them real. And being real requires risk. It requires accepting that the truth may change things, but also trusting that anything worth preserving should be able to survive reality. A relationship that depends on silence to function is already under strain. A relationship that can face the truth has a chance to evolve. That's why this moment matters. Not because secrets are inherently evil, but because unspoken truths quietly shape outcomes. They steer decisions. They limit possibilities. And at some point, choosing not to speak becomes an active choice with consequences. So here's the thought I want to leave you with. The cost of silence is rarely paid all at once, but it is always paid in full. And sooner or later, you have to decide whether you want to spend your energy maintaining a secret or building something honest enough to carry real weight. At some point, after carrying a secret long enough, something shifts. It's not dramatic. There's no sudden epiphany or cinematic moment where everything snaps into focus. It's quieter than that, more rational. You begin to notice that the reasons you once used to justify silence no longer hold up under scrutiny. The logic expires. Early on, secrecy feels like a temporary strategy. You tell yourself there's a right time to speak, and this simply isn't it. You're waiting for stability, for less stress, for the relationship to feel stronger, safer, more capable of absorbing impact. But time has a way of exposing faulty assumptions. Stability doesn't arrive on its own. Safety isn't something you postpone your way into. And relationships don't become stronger by avoiding reality, they become stronger by integrating it. Psychologically, this is the moment when avoidance stops working. The mind is very good at short-term suppression, but it's terrible at long-term containment. What you resist doesn't disappear, it demands more attention. The secret starts showing up in indirect ways: hesitation in conversations, emotional delay, a growing gap between what you feel and what you express. You may still be present, but you're no longer fully engaged, and eventually, that partial engagement feels dishonest, not just to the other person, but to yourself. This is usually when the internal question changes. It's no longer what if I tell them and everything falls apart. It becomes what is already falling apart because I haven't. That's a critical pivot. It reframes honesty from a risk to a necessity, from a potential disruption to a form of maintenance. Systems, whether technological, social, or emotional, fail when feedback is suppressed. The longer bad data is ignored, the more catastrophic the correction tends to be. There's also a moral clarity that emerges here, though it's less about right and wrong and more about responsibility. You start to recognize that withholding the truth isn't neutral. It actively shapes the other person's decisions. They're making choices based on incomplete information about the relationship, about the future, about you. Even if your intentions are protective, the outcome is still distortion, and distortion compounds. Philosophers have argued for centuries that truth has an intrinsic value, independent of convenience, not because truth is always pleasant, but because it's stabilizing. It grounds action. It allows people to orient themselves accurately in the world. When you deny someone access to the truth, you're denying them the ability to respond freely. That realization tends to land heavily when love is involved, because love at its core is about mutual recognition, not control. So why now? Because the internal cost-benefit analysis finally becomes unavoidable. The energy spent managing silence exceeds the energy required to face consequences. You realize that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's deciding that something else matters more. In this case, what matters more is integrity, living in a way where your inner reality and outer behavior are no longer at odds. There's also a forward-looking logic at play. You begin to think less about preserving the present moment and more about building something that can actually last. Any future built on omission is structurally weak. It limits how far you can go together. Certain conversations can't happen. Certain plans feel constrained. Why? We're designing a life around a missing variable. At some point, that becomes untenable. This is where honesty stops being about confession and starts being about alignment, about clearing the system so it can operate efficiently again, about removing noise. You're not speaking because it's easy. You're speaking because clarity is the only path forward that doesn't involve slow erosion. And importantly, this decision isn't driven by optimism about the outcome. You don't speak because you're confident it will go well. You speak because you've accepted that uncertainty is preferable to false stability, that whatever happens next should be real. Truth gives you that. It doesn't guarantee comfort, but it guarantees authenticity. And authenticity over time is the only sustainable state. So when the truth comes out now, it's not impulsive, it's not reckless. It's the result of prolonged reflection, of understanding that delay has consequences, and that silence is not a free option. It's the recognition that honesty is not an interruption of love, but a requirement for its continuation. And here's the closing thought to sit with. There is a moment when waiting stops being patience and becomes avoidance. And growth begins the instant you choose to tell the truth anyway. When the moment finally arrives to speak, it doesn't feel like relief. That's a misconception people often have. They imagine confession as a release valve, pressure gone, weight lifted. In reality, it feels more like stepping into open air after being underground for too long. Exposed, bright, uncontrolled, you're no longer managing the narrative in your head, you're offering it to someone else, knowing they will interpret it in ways you can't predict. This is where vulnerability becomes real. Not the curated kind, not the softened version designed to minimize discomfort, but the kind that involves full ownership. Psychologically, this matters. People don't respond to truth alone. They respond to how responsibility is handled. A confession that externalizes blame, that hides behind context or justification, is still a form of self-protection. It may be factual, but it's not honest in the deeper sense. Real honesty includes accountability for impact, not just intent. So when you speak, the most difficult part isn't stating what happened or what you feel. It's resisting the impulse to control the outcome. The mind wants to frame, to cushion, to guide the listener toward a specific conclusion. But the moment you do that, you're back to managing instead of revealing. Philosophically, this is the difference between truth as information and truth as relationship. Information can be optimized, relationship cannot. There's also a subtle but important shift that happens here. Up until now, the secret belonged to you. Once spoken, it becomes shared reality. That transfer is destabilizing because it removes your monopoly on interpretation. The other person now has the right to react, to feel, to reassess. That loss of control is precisely what makes the confession meaningful. Love that only survives under managed conditions isn't love. It's dependency on predictability. From a psychological standpoint, this is where trust has a chance to recalibrate. Trust isn't built by perfection, it's built by consistency between words and actions, and by the willingness to face consequences without treat. When you confess without defensiveness, without rushing to explain yourself out of discomfort, you signal something powerful, that you respect the other person enough to let them see you clearly, even if what they see is flawed. This is also where shame often tries to intervene. Shame says, if they really know you, they'll leave. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. The difference matters. Guilt can coexist with growth. Shame collapses identity. A grounded confession avoids shame language and focuses instead on responsibility and choice. Not this is who I am, but this is what I did, this is what I feel, and this is what I'm willing to face. Philosophically, this aligns with a long-standing idea. Dignity comes from agency. By owning your truth, you reclaim agency over it. You're no longer hiding, rationalizing, or fragmenting yourself. You're presenting a unified self, imperfect, yes, but coherent. That coherence is what allows real dialogue to begin. Without it, conversations orbit around symptoms instead of causes. There's another hard truth here. Confession doesn't guarantee forgiveness, understanding, or continuity. And it's not supposed to. The purpose isn't to secure a specific response. The purpose is to restore reality. Anything that happens after that, repair, separation, rebuilding, happens on honest ground. That matters more than comfort, because comfort without truth is fragile. It collapses under pressure. When people avoid confession, they often say they're afraid of hurting the other person. Sometimes that's true, but often they're afraid of witnessing the hurt, of seeing disappointment reflected back at them, of sitting with the consequences long enough for them to feel real. Yet paradoxically, that willingness to stay present in the discomfort is what makes reconciliation possible, if it's going to happen at all. In relationships, repair isn't driven by flawless behavior, it's driven by repair attempts that are sincere, unguarded, and sustained. A single confession doesn't solve everything, but it opens the door to processes that secrecy keeps locked. It allows both people to respond to the same reality, rather than two different versions of it. And if there's one thing worth emphasizing here, it's this. Vulnerability isn't weakness because it doesn't reduce your strength. It clarifies it. It shows that you can face uncertainty without collapsing, that you value truth over image, and that you're willing to let reality shape the outcome rather than manipulate it. So the confession, when it finally happens, isn't the end of the story. It's the point where the story becomes real. And that's the thought to take with you. Truth doesn't promise safety, but it does promise solidity, and anything meaningful you hope to build will need that foundation to stand. After the truth is spoken, there's a temptation to believe the hardest part is over. It isn't. In many ways, this is where the real work begins. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind driven by grand gestures or emotional speeches, but the quieter, more disciplined work of rebuilding alignment. Love doesn't automatically repair itself once honesty is restored. What honesty does is clear the terrain so something real can be constructed. Accountability is the first requirement, and accountability isn't self-punishment, it's reliability. It's the willingness to let your future behavior be shaped by what you've acknowledged. Psychologically, people regain trust not because they hear the right words, but because they observe consistency over time. Apologies matter, but patterns matter more. The brain is designed to detect trends. One moment of sincerity can open the door, but only sustained coherence keeps it open. This is also where humility becomes essential. When you tell the truth, you don't get to decide how long it takes for the other person to integrate it. Emotional processing doesn't follow a schedule. There may be questions that repeat, emotions that resurface, moments where progress feels nonlinear. None of that means honesty was a mistake. It means the system is recalibrating. Stability after disruption always takes longer than the disruption itself. Philosophically, this phase reflects a deeper truth about relationships. Commitment isn't proven at the moment of confession, it's proven in what follows. Anyone can speak when the pressure becomes unbearable. Fewer people stay present when the consequences unfold slowly. Staying is not about endurance for its own sake. It's about demonstrating that the truth wasn't a performance but a turning point. Hope, in this context, isn't blind optimism. It's informed intention. It's the decision to act as if the relationship is worth the effort of repair, even without guarantees. Hope doesn't deny risk, it accepts it and moves forward anyway. That kind of hope is rational. It's grounded in the understanding that complexity doesn't disappear just because something is difficult. It's worked through, not bypassed. There's also an important shift in power dynamics that happens here. Once everything is on the table, the relationship becomes more symmetrical. Both people are now responding to the same reality. That doesn't mean equality of emotion or perspective, but it does mean shared context. From there, trust can be rebuilt not as blind faith, but as earned confidence. Confidence that problems will be addressed directly, not buried. Rebuilding doesn't always mean restoring things exactly as they were. In fact, trying to return to the old version is often a mistake. That version existed under conditions of partial truth. What comes next has the potential to be stronger, not because it's flawless, but because it's resilient. Systems that survive stress tend to be better adapted than those that avoid it entirely. And sometimes honesty leads to a difficult conclusion, that love doesn't continue in the same form. Even then, accountability still matters. Ending something truthfully is not a failure of love, it's a refusal to let love exist as illusion. Respect doesn't disappear when a relationship changes shape. In many cases, it finally becomes possible. What matters most is this: once you choose honesty, you don't revert. You don't use truth as a one-time event. You integrate it as a principle. You decide that whatever happens next, repair, transformation, or release, will be handled in the open. That decision alone alters how you show up, not just in one relationship, but in all of them. Psychologically, people who live this way experience less internal fragmentation. They spend less energy managing appearances and more energy building substance. Over time, that creates a kind of quiet confidence. Not arrogance, not certainty, but steadiness. The knowledge that whatever you face, you'll face it directly. So if there's a forward-looking takeaway here, it's this: love isn't preserved by avoiding what's hard. It's deepened by meeting it with clarity, patience, and responsibility. Honesty doesn't guarantee outcomes, but it guarantees that whatever you build next will be real. And that's the final thought to leave with you. The future doesn't belong to the fearless. It belongs to those willing to tell the truth, stay present, and build from there.